Labour's vile treatment of Diane Abbott is an injustice in itself, and revealing about how the party will behave when they get the whopping big landslide, which is absolutely inevitable in 5 weeks' time, thanks, of course, to the Conservatives' self-destruction, which is why, as I keep saying, you're free to vote according to your conscience without risks. Now, Diane Abbott's treatment compared to white male allies of the Labour leadership speaks for itself, a toxic combination of factionalism and racism. And it also speaks to the obsessive and shameless rampant dishonesty of Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer himself, who's set to be our Prime Minister for at least the next 5 years. Now, that the party has managed to plunge itself into crisis over this in the midst of a completely unlosable election is testament to the sheer commitment of this crew to factional spite. Now, Diane Abbott was elected the first female black MP in British history back in 1987, which involved overcoming astonishing odds at the time, and thus was of particular significance, of course, to a whole generation of black Britons, something she alluded to in her victory speech at the time.
And I am aware that a lot of hopes, not just in Hackney, but across the country, ride on our victory tonight. I hope and believe that I can fulfil those hopes.
Now, Diane Abbott was long a prominent backbencher, a former junior minister and a leadership candidate. She also carved out a public position as a broadcaster. And when Jeremy Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party, was a senior member of his shadow cabinet. Now, Diane Abbott has always been subjected to relentless racist attacks. And with her increased prominence, that only escalated. A study about the run-up to the 2017 general election found she received nearly more abuse than every other single female MP in Britain put together. Now, much of this abuse was directly stirred up by our aggressive right-wing media, by Conservative politicians, by right-wing social media accounts. But we should also note the frankly diabolical treatment she's received from within her own party. The Labour MP Jess Phillips, who's carved out a public profile as a feminist, a defender of women in public life from abuse, publicly boasted that she had told Diane Abbott to fuck off to her face. That was obviously an attempt to humiliate and demean. And what makes it even worse is that Diane Abbott later clarified that Jess Phillips had never told her to fuck off. So the entire story was invented purely to humiliate. So in this context, this clip on ITV should be seen as school ground bullying at best, and the sort of treatment I would personally struggle to find examples of when directed at white female politicians.
And is it Jess's favourite Diane Abbott?
Robert, we really have to unite around Jeremy. And if Jess cannot unite around Jeremy,
This is sort of uncanny.
then she will be hearing from my friends, Big Frank and Harry the Hatchet. Because we really need to have a talk about uniting around Jeremy.
Are you feeling quite scared over that?
Now, after a leaked report after the 2019 general election detailing abusive messages from Labour officials emerged, Martin Ford QC, a prominent and accomplished black barrister in Britain, was commissioned by Keir Starmer to investigate, among other things, questions of racism within the Labour Party. Those messages included staffers mocking and insulting Diane Abbott after she was found crying in the toilets after such abuse. And in the words of the Ford report, the criticisms of Diane Abbott are not simply a harsh response to perceived poor performance. They are expressions of visceral disgust, drawing on racist tropes, and they bear little resemblance to the criticisms of white male MPs elsewhere in the messages. Now, listen to this from Channel 4 News from last year.
The black MPs I've spoken to don't want to speak on camera. They worried that if they do, they fear they'll lose the whip. But privately, one said to me that when it comes to anti-black racism, the party is lacklustre at best. Another said when it comes to progress, that the party was just going through the motions. It felt performative. And another really worried what this would do to the relationship between the Labour Party and the black community. So angry and frustrated were some that Channel 4 News has seen a letter drafted to the Labour leader from few black MPs. In it, they say,
"Despite our party's claim to be anti-racist, we, our members and supporters, are losing faith in the ability and commitment of this leadership to tackle the issues raised in the Ford report, and we demand urgent action."
Black Labour MPs scared of talking about anti-black racism in the Labour Party for fear of being purged if they do so. What do you even say? What do you even say at this point? Now, last year, Diane Abbott wrote a letter to the Observer newspaper relating to a debate at the time about differing experiences of racism and prejudice and how they should be categorised, which she retracted and apologised for. But she was suspended from the Labour Party with an investigation which left her in limbo, apparently, for many, many months. This contrasted with, let's take an example, Barry Shearman, a Labour MP, he's a white man and a supporter of Keir Starmer, who after a rumour about 2 high-profile Jewish businessmen missing out on peerages, tweeted about a run on silver shekels, a gratuitously anti-Semitic trope. But he was allowed to simply apologise and no further action was taken. When Labour's Rochdale by-election candidate suggested the 7th of October attacks were an inside job by Israel and criticised media figures from what he described as certain Jewish quarters, the Labour leadership tried to stand by him. Now, here's a particularly egregious example. Neil Coyle, a white man, a Labour MP who backs Keir Starmer, made racist comments directly to a political reporter's face. He was suspended but later readmitted despite a sexual harassment complaint also being upheld against him. Meanwhile, Labour went on to suspend one of their few other black female MPs, Kate Osamor, after she described Israel's genocide in Gaza as a genocide on the day that the International Court of Justice put Israel on trial for alleged genocide. Now, Diane Abbott was left in limbo. And back in March, comments by the Conservative donor Frank Hester emerged in which he said Diane Abbott makes you want to hate all black women and said that she should be shot. Now, the Labour leadership milked this row. Literally, they tried to make money out of it. While refusing to readmit Diane Abbott to her party, they sent out an email to Labour members denouncing the Tory party's biggest donor for racist comments without mentioning who the victim was, asking those members to offer the party donations off the back of it. Just gruesome stuff. It gets worse. Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak had a debate at Prime Minister's questions about the racist comments directed at Diane Abbott. Diane Abbott stood up 46 times in that debate to be called to have an intervention, to be able to speak in a debate quite literally about racist comments made towards her, and she was not called once by the Speaker. This is a Speaker, a former Labour MP, who previously trashed a SNP motion on collective punishment, which Labour did not want to be voted on. With Labour officials at the time briefing journalists, they had told the Speaker he would lose his job when the party won a majority if they didn't do his bidding. Now, the Speaker claimed he couldn't call her for reasons of time. She wasn't on the order paper. But the Lib Dem MP leader, Ed Davey, wasn't either. And the Speaker called him. After this diabolical PMQs, Keir Starmer approached Diane Abbott and the conversation went like this: let me know if there's anything I can do. And then she says you could restore the whip. He says, I understand, just let me know if there's anything. She says, restore the whip. And he says, I understand. Absolutely peculiar behaviour. To note, just to be clear, he wasn't restoring the whip. Now, Keir Starmer kept insisting there was an independent investigation into Diane Abbott, which meant he couldn't involve himself. Bear in mind, this is back in March as you listen to it.
That process needs to complete.
But it's been 11 months, hasn't it? It's been a long... Why has it taken so long, Mr. Keir? Why?
One of the changes I made when I became leader was to take the leader out of that process and make it truly independent, because under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, all sorts of problems happened.
It was one letter. Why has it taken 11 months? Andy MacDonald, he had a case. It's just been resolved. It took 5 months. Rupert Huck had a case. Took 5 months.
Yeah.
This is one letter. It's taken 11 months. What is there left to investigate?
There are aspects to the process which take time.
It could be a general election in
resolved.
5 weeks.
Look,
she doesn't know if she's going to be an MP anymore.
Well, that just turns out to be a lie, a total lie. There was no investigation at the time. It turned out yesterday, as the journalist Victoria Derbyshire revealed, that this investigation concluded 5 months ago. She was given a formal warning in December 2023. She was then required to do an online anti-Semitism course, which she completed in February. So that meant the investigation now left her in the clear. So what that means is it was in the power of the chief whip of the Labour Party, the Parliamentary Labour Party, to decide her future. Because what remained to be decided is whether the whip was restored. That is, whether she remained a member, or she was readmitted, as a member of the Parliamentary Labour Party. And who does the chief whip report to? You guessed it, the leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer. How could Keir Starmer possibly not know this? How could he not know the investigation was over? Now the decision rested with the Labour leadership about what happened next. So what happens a few hours after this latest revelation? Labour sources then leaked to the Times newspaper, an outlet owned by Rupert Murdoch, traditionally, of course, a Conservative outlet, capital C, still a Conservative outlet, that she would not be allowed to stand as a Labour candidate, that there were no circumstances, they briefed, in which she would stand under the Labour banner, and that senior aides had held discussions about restoring the Labour whip to her before the election to allow her to leave politics with dignity. An absolute farce, because that briefing again can only be understood as an attempt to utterly humiliate Diane Abbott. And surely enough, the whip was restored, but that's not relevant to the question of whether she'll be allowed to stand as a Labour candidate, bearing in mind the investigations are now concluded. In fact, the investigation's concluded and the whip's been restored, so what reason would there be for her not to stand again as the Labour candidate for Hackney North and Stoke Newington, a seat she has held since 1987? Now, this morning, Diane Abbott told Sky News' Sophie Ridge that as of yesterday evening, I've not heard from the party directly, but the Times story is true. Now, let's listen to John McTurnan, Tony Blair's former Director of Political Operations, not someone I should note with my politics.
It's not for the Labour Party to ban a woman with Diane Abbott's record from standing in for the Labour Party if that's what she wishes to do. I can understand if Diane wants to have the whip restored to her and choose to stand down herself, but this kind of briefing, it's aimed at humiliating her, and that is disgraceful. It's just utterly disgraceful.
OK, what do you read into it? Obviously, there's more to learn about all of this, but what do you think is really going on then?
Contempt for the record of the first black woman MP, contempt for the record of an MP who's campaigned not for my part of the Labour Party, but campaigned for London, campaigned for Londoners, campaigned for black women, for women, and a process that's been designed not to resolve issues.
Well, indeed, it is about humiliating the first black female MP. Now, let's listen to this evidence, which has been offered up, or this briefing from a source.
There is an even stronger view amongst supporters of Keir Starmer that Diane Abbott must not stand in this election. So what the Keir Starmer group are saying, allies close to the leader of the Labour Party, is they want dignity for Diane Abbott. One of his allies described her to me as an icon of the Labour movement. But they equally say that Diane Abbott cannot stay because she is, in their view, a reminder of the Jeremy Corbyn era, which they say was an era of failure. And one ally told me that on the doorstep, that incident where Diane Abbott, when she was Shadow Home Secretary in a general election campaign, struggling to sort of explain the numbers behind a policy, they say that comes up on the doorstep and that is damaging.
So that has nothing to do with an investigation about questions of racism, but about an interview which went badly 7 years ago. Now, lots of politicians in this country have had bad interviews, including mixing their sums up. They did not receive the sort of vicious treatment Britain's first elected black female MP did. And if we're going down the route of banning MPs for messing up interviews, where does that leave Keir Starmer himself, who did huge damage to the Labour Party, not least causing massive anger amongst so many traditional Labour voters when he went on LBC and declared Israel had the right to cut off water and energy to civilians, and then repeatedly lied about what he'd said. Mixing up your sums 7 years ago means you should have your career ended. But legitimising war crimes, specific war crimes, which went on to form a core pillar of the International Criminal Court's chief prosecutor's request for arrest warrants for the Israeli leadership, that's fine, is it? Now let's listen to this latest interview with the Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, interviewed by Lewis Goodall on LBC.
I would just say, Wes, that the truth is, and we all know this, I know this, you know it, it's pure factionalism. All this is about in the Labour Party is pure factionalism. If Diane Abbott were in Keir Starmer's faction, she'd be allowed to stand again. And we both know that.
There are plenty of people, I mean, I'll just point out, you know, in the case of a Labour candidate in the northwest of England, who, when he was a Labour MP, was very much on Keir Starmer's wing of the Labour Party. He remains... his future remains in doubt. He was suspended because of comments that he made. As I say, the rules are applied fairly and consistently across the Labour Party. And frankly, I think people listening, people who are thinking about the next general election will be more worried about the state of our economy, the state of our public services and 7.5 million people on the NHS waiting list than they will worry about any of us as individual politicians, and rightly so.
Well, I think that people might also think that Keir Starmer and your party say that you want to return public life to high standards and openness and transparency and integrity, and you can make a very strong argument that is not happening here.
Well, indeed. Toxic factionalism with a core of racism running through it. Labour are now complaining that their own despicable toxic treatment of their first ever black female MP is distracting them from issues that they want to talk about, which, given their lack of policies, frankly, is quite the statement. Now, I would note that before this latest saga, Keir Starmer had the worst net satisfaction amongst ethnic minority Britons of any leader of the opposition, Labour leader of the opposition, since records began in 1996, on -21. That is about 50 points lower than during the last Labour leadership landslide in 1997. Now, there are indeed reports that Sana Begum, a Muslim Labour MP, who is another woman of colour, a victim of domestic violence, is also being subjected to a deselection attempt. Now, I would just conclude by saying this. Labour are, as they keep saying, going to win no matter what. The Tories really are toast. They're lost. They've lost this election. There's no chance whatsoever of them winning. You do deserve to know what kind of government you will have for at least the next 5 years. And the evidence is there. You just need to look at it. They're a very unpleasant authoritarian clique who are intolerant of dissent and whose record of racism speaks for itself. There is a reason why a lifelong Labour supporter like myself would, for the first time in my adult life, and bear in mind, I'm 39, I have been able to vote for 21 years, would choose not to vote for the Labour Party for the first time in a general election, which is why I would advise you to use the pressure and leverage you do have to vote Green or Independent, given Labour's going to win anyway, and the more you do that, the more pressure there will be on them to stop this sort of behaviour and actually do something to solve the country's problems. Please like and subscribe. Do leave your comments. Love to hear what you think. Help us with the channel to do our election coverage. We've got our first documentary on Bristol and the Green Challenge there coming up this week. Do listen to us podcast, like, subscribe. Speak to you soon.